Good evening. I'm Don Messer. I'm the chair of the United Methodist Association of Retired Clergy and Friends, and we welcome you to this Zoom seminar tonight on to stay or not to stay. That's the question facing United Methodists. We have persons gathered from across the United States and around the world in this Zoom conversation. So I welcome each of you on behalf of UMARC. UMARC was created as a committed organization dedicated to an inclusive United Methodist Church, epitomizing the inclusive love of God in Jesus Christ for all people. We were formed as clergy and friends who offer unwavering support of our own Bishop, Karen Oliveto, and to express solidarity with LGBTQ clergy, laity, and candidates for ministry, and are committed to working toward the global dignity and safety of all persons in church and society. We are indeed an advocate for inclusion of all persons in the church. We affirm the joy of being United Methodists when we are grateful for our church and we have great hopes for the United Methodist Church of the future. Lest we forget, United Methodists have joyfully embodied the mission and ministry of Jesus Christ in the world for nearly 55 years. To be a United Methodist is to live and to love and to serve, not as a people of fundamentalist doctrine, but of faithful compassion, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, helping the poor, reaching out to the marginalized and stigmatized. Oh yes, we have failed. For to be a United Methodist is to acknowledge and to repent of our flaws and our sins, and to continue to work for social justice and against racism, sexism, homophobia, and environmental destruction. We seek to make our church better, and we call upon our friends to join us. For to be a United Methodist is to embrace a quadrilateral way of doing theology, affirming the Bible, tradition, reason, and experience. We want to thank tonight the sponsors who have helped us create this free webinar, which has been enrolled in by over 1,000 people. It will be recorded and it will be on our website at umarc.org in a few days. Those of you who like to support the efforts to create more free webinars and other services to promote the inclusive nature of the church can give through going to our website and making a credit card gift, or writing a check and designating it to the Mountain Sky Conference and mailing it to me at my address here in Colorado. Because of the popularity of this webinar, and because inevitably we are not going to answer every question you have on your mind tonight, if we have 1,000 people asking questions and there's so much to be covered, we've scheduled a second session coming up on May 17th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with the tentative title, Buyer Beware, Exploring Differences with Breakaway Methodist Denomination. This title and some of the plans may change. The speakers haven't all been arranged, but you will need to re-register for that webinar. We'll be sending out notices to you in the days ahead, but we wanted you to know that if you haven't got your question answered tonight, there's going to be opportunities in the future. So now we move to introduce tonight's host. First of all, we have Dr. Rebecca Miles, the Susanna Wesley Professor of Practical Theology, Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist, as our host. She will be providing the leadership along with her colleague, the Reverend Dr. Israel Alvaran, United Methodist clergy leader from the Philippines and staff member of the Reconciling Ministries Network based in San Francisco. We're grateful for both of these key leaders in our church, along with the panelists who come to us from Western Pennsylvania. Tracy Merrick, lay delegate or alternate to 7 general conferences, the Reverend Dr. B.T. Gilligan, senior pastor of Nixon United Methodist Church in Butler, Pennsylvania, and the Reverend Dr. David Morse, the retired seminary lecturer on United Methodism at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. These 3 men have done great work in analyzing the details that are so comprehensive. And together we're going to have a conversation led off tonight by my good friend and esteemed colleague and former student, Dr. Rebecca Miles.
Yes, all the years we've been doing this. So thank you, Don. If y'all don't know, Don Messer is the former president of ILF School of Theology and Dakota Wesleyan. And I'm grateful for that, and also for your the global work you've done to combat world hunger and HIV/AIDS. And I'm grateful to this Association of Retired Clergy. It's a terrific organization. And for Harvey Marks, who's here, also from ILF and a retired pastor in Mountain Sky, and to Jim Dozer, who's our tech guy in the background. So while I tell you what's going to happen tonight, we'll get a poll going. So Jim, if you would put up that laity clergy status poll. So on your screen, you're going to see a little, yeah, and you can either put layperson, active clergy, retired clergy. If you're none of the above, that's fine. Just wing it or put nothing. Or if you can't figure out how to do it, that's all fine too. But it's coming up, and it'll be, we've got, how long are these polls? We'll find out in a minute. So let me tell you a little about this evening. So the wonderful Izzy Alvaron and I have a list of questions, and we're going to alternate with our questions. And we also have a way for y'all to ask questions, especially through the Q&A. You should know that we won't be able to get to all of them, and it's not personal at all. Even hours before this started, we had people already submitting questions. But we'll get to some of them tonight, and we'll get to some of them on May 17th, and maybe we can find a way to put up another Q&A on the website where you registered. So we can see the results. We got 50. Oh, it's okay. It's still going. Never mind. Okay. So we'll see if we can find a way to put them on the site where you registered. So we'll just let that go, and before we do another one. So my other job, in addition to questioning and setup, is to explain to you where we are as a church and how we got here in 3 minutes or less. Now that's not possible, right? So I thought about how far back to go, like to the 20 years when I've been going to general conferences, and how things have gotten worse, or back to 72, which is pivotal in the conversations about sexuality, or back to the birth of the United Methodist Church, or American Methodism, or Wesley, or Luther, or Jesus, or the Big Bang, but I won't do that, right? So I think you'll believe me and trust me when I say that United Methodists have been experiencing conflict, and it's gotten worse. And the biggest part of that, and most public, has been around the marriage and ordination and full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons. There are also issues like organizational structure, regional autonomy, money. But we're stuck not only because we disagree, because people always disagree, and not only because we disagree about those particular things, but also because the rules of our church make it difficult for us to resolve those problems, right? We've got our poll. So we've got 58% lay people, 20 and 21 active and retired clergy. Thank y'all for doing that. So we have this problem, not only that we have some difficult rules, but also we only meet every 4 years, right, to make our rules, except of course when there's a global pandemic, right, and you have really long delays. You can take that down, great. In any case, what I call this is polity hell, right? Because part of what's going on is we're stuck because of some of our rules, in addition to the huge issues that are before us. I also say sometimes we're up shit creek without a paddle, but we do have some people making paddles, right? So not long before the pandemic, you may remember that some leaders met and they worked out a non-binding deal called the Protocol that would allow churches and annual conferences to disaffiliate it if they wanted to and join another denomination. We thought we were going to have maybe two, a progressive and a more conservative denomination that would split off. It looks like the progressive may not, it's not clear yet, but the Global Methodist Church, the more conservative, will launch on May 1, though the transition will take a while. So until we meet as a global body in 2024, we can't vote on the protocol. So in the meantime, we're trying to sort out what the rules and figure out what can happen, right? And churches and Methodists are looking at the differences between the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church. And we're talking tonight about some of those details. So let me offer you 2 words of hope before I give my first question. So first, the general structure may be in polity hell, right? But there are great ministries going on all over the church, all over the world. Progressive churches, conservative churches, all of the above churches, prison ministries, worship services, feeding the hungry, caring for youth, caring for, working with the homeless, with all kinds of different ministries. So I try to remember that. And the second word of hope is we're going to find a way through. It won't be pretty or fast, but it'll get done and things will get better. And I pray that we will have a more just and inclusive church. So of the people who are helping us get through this mess are the 3 United Methodists tonight from the Western Pennsylvania Conference. And they've written a Q&A document. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. That's fair and measured and straightforward. And I just so appreciate it. So I want to thank you, gentlemen, for this document where you lay out some of the differences between the United Methodist and the Global Methodist Church, and also what people would need to do if they wanted to stay or go to one or the other. And I want to begin by asking you, and this had to be a lot of work, right? So how did the 3 of you decide to do this document and a similar one before? Why did y'all engage in that?
Thank you, Becca, for asking that question, and I'll start if you don't mind. When information started becoming available here in Western Pennsylvania, and there was a fair amount of it from the WCA, we realized that we were getting a part of the story. And when the Transitional Book of Discipline became available, we decided we ought to take a look at it and just see what was in it. And there are a couple of us that have done this work that just really love to dig into that sort of stuff. So we did, and we decided that we would like to provide a summary to the church that would be accurate and readable, and that would assist churches, laity, and clergy as they begin to think about whether or not they were going to stay in the United Methodist Church or join the Global Methodist Church. And we hope that we've achieved that. The goal was for it to be fair. BT or Dave, did you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Tracy said, but also, I'm pastoring a small rural church in northwestern Pennsylvania area, and my congregation here is very much looking for information, figuring out how to decide, and I needed a way to present it to them in a way that kind of made sense. And so I think it was David who did the initial work and sat down with a small group of us, and I said, this would be great. We need a way to get it to congregations, including ours. So that's really what we did, is we sat down and did the first version. And then now this version, the second version that we've done, just to try and get it out to as many people as possible, because there's so many more issues beyond just that top presenting issue that we see everywhere. There's things underneath the surface that we should know before we get into it and make decisions.
I agree. Ditto.
And I put the link to the document we're talking about tonight in the chat, and there will be other links. There are some links also in the site, the place where you registered, and there'll be other links and documents available there over time that we hope will help resource congregations. Izzy, are you ready?
Let's get into the meat of this conversation. Let's start it off. There might be some uncertainties about the draft versions of the Book of Doctrine and Discipline, the BODD, of the Global Methodist Church, or the GMC. I see that you all are using in your paper different drafts of this BODD. And then there's also the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline. The actual Global Methodist Church may be different. When will we know for sure what the GMC policies will be? Because their convening general conference will probably be spring of next year. Can you address these uncertainties?
Sure. I'll start with this question. Thanks, Izzy.
Sure.
I think it's important for us to understand, as you said, there are 2 documents. One is called the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline. This was written by the Transitional Council that will lead the Global Methodist Church when it first forms in just a few weeks. The draft Book of Doctrine and Discipline is one that will go into effect after the Global Methodist Church has its first general conference. That has been written by another group of folks, different from the Transitional Council. And we need to also understand that both of these books can undergo changes between over time. Especially the draft book of discipline we expect that it would be adjusted at that first convening general conference. So it's important to understand these are fluid. In fact, we have just learned that there's another version of the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline that was just released, and our group is going to be taking a look at it as well.
So does this mean in the meantime, the churches are joining or contemplating joining the GMC? For example, the Bulgaria-Romania annual conference, by the way, over the weekend voted to do that. Are they joining the GMC without knowing what the exact final rules will be?
Basically, that's it. And the Global Methodist Church folks are very open about that. And so there's no real way at this point of knowing with perfect certainty what's going to end up in particularly the document that will be presented to their convening general conference, which will probably occur, as you said, in about a year or two.
Okay, so how about changes? What have you seen that are changes between these drafts? Dave, you want to answer that?
Sure. I mean, basically speaking, at this point, the only draft that is legally binding is the current Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline. And as Tracy pointed out, if you study both of these texts, it's reasonably clear that two different groups comprise them, because there are some differences between the two. I've at least identified 5 in my analysis, and if people are interested in that, we can elaborate on that. But to give you just a very small, but I think not insignificant example, in the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, it says that the pastor has sole discretion to receive a member in, but if the pastor exercises that discretion and says you can't become a member, you can then appeal to the pastor parish committee. In the draft book of Doctrine and Discipline, which is still simply a proposal, one might even say an aspirational statement, the pastor is given absolute, sole, unappealable description. Now, that's just a single example of a few changes that are very different between the two texts. But as I've tried to say to people right now, if you're contemplating making this decision, the text you need to focus on is the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, because that is the one that will be operative in guiding the transition until such time as there is a convening initial general conference, which I think, as we talk today, I've been told could be anywhere from 12 to 24 months.
Okay, thank you.
Do any of the rest of y'all have any comments about that?
Uncertainties.
I wanted to ask a follow-up on that. So there are a few differences. So for example, I noticed that they went from the 44 sermons of John Wesley to the 53, but most of the text is the same. So they were written, then a different group is in charge, but it looks like the same document to me altered over time. And I've got like 4 or 5 different versions. And a lot of the alterations aren't big, they're small things, like going from the 53 to the 44 sermons. Is that correct? It's pretty much the same with alterations.
There's quite a bit of similarity, and especially when you're looking at the doctrinal statements, those are relatively similar to what is in the United Methodist Church. The thing that stood out most to me is in the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, you have this paragraph 351, which in effect says if a congregation or a pastor does not give evidence of conforming rather thoroughly to the doctrinal teachings of the Global Methodist Church, that a process can be set in motion that can finally lead to involuntary disaffiliation. Now, that's a fairly interesting paragraph that people ought to be aware of. There's absolutely nothing like that in our current United Methodist Book of Discipline. But what is interesting is when you move to the draft Book of Doctrine and Discipline, that paragraph is completely omitted. Now, What
Thank
that
you.
means, I don't know, but
Yeah.
someone who wrote that would have to speak to that.
Yeah, so that's helpful, and we can get to some of those issues as we go along. So I'm grateful, and we'll talk about the theology and doctrine when we get further too, because that's of particular interest to me. And the main statements are the same, but here's a question. Another question we want to start with early. Tell us something good. So tell us something that you actually found helpful about either the structure or the process or of the Global Methodist Church book of their rules, of their structure. And I know all of us are planning to stay in the United Methodist Church, but tell me something that you found helpful about their rule book, their process, something.
To start off with, I personally like their return to the more ecumenical / traditional understanding of the processes for ordination, where someone is ordained a deacon, then ordained an elder, but at the same time, they have made provision for retaining a permanent diaconate. I think that's just ecumenically good. I frankly think we made a mistake when we changed.
Hey, we're already getting into all kinds of issues because I disagree with that, but that's okay.
Okay, yeah.
This is perfect. This is perfect. See, Methodists, even on the same side, disagree on all this stuff. Tracy and BT, do y'all have things to jump in with?
BT, go ahead. I'll follow
Okay.
up.
I was going to say, not just so much about these books, but of their overall process. What I liked, and we as United Methodists could actually take a little bit from this, they are very well organized. Their messages have been consistent. They're just how they've put themselves together. They're a professional organization. They might be taking a different stance than I am. I am staying United Methodist, but I can respect that they're at least doing things in a consistent method.
And I guess I would just add that as I've looked at it, I saw some provisions in the appointment process that I kind of liked in terms of additional collaboration between the Episcopal office and the district superintendent that we don't always see in all our annual conferences here in the United Methodist Church. Just an interesting thing to think about and look at. So I guess we'll get to the next question.
Before we go to Izzy, I wanted to say, so one of the things that I love is they get to start over with the Book of Discipline, right? They can start from scratch. That'll be complicated. But also want to respond, someone in the chat has said that they thought that they're a little disappointed that we're all staying with the United Methodist Church. So I want to say the United Methodist Association of Retired Clergy, they're clearly in support of the United Methodist Church. And I think they chose this document by these three authors and those of us here because we all have tried really hard to be fair. And I will say this document is, they've got chapter and verse of everything laid out, right? So I think it's fair, but yeah, I think it's pretty clear we're all planning to stay with the United Methodist Church. All right, Izzy, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm thank you for sharing the good things that you see and maybe things that you actually envy in the process of establishing a new denomination. But to all three of you, could you share what concerns you the most? What provisions of the transitional or any of the draft books of Doctrine and Discipline concern you the most?
I'll go ahead and go first, if that's okay.
Please.
I just saw something in the chat, and I would just like to repeat one thing. That is, there was a person said we were kind of talking over your heads using the two terms. Let me try to explain them one additional time. The transitional book is the book that will go into effect effective May 1st and will be in effect until they have their convening general conference in a year or two. The draft book of discipline is one that will be presented to that general conference for it to act on and perhaps modify, and then would go into effect after that convening general conference. So we will be using those two terms. I hope that helps a little bit. But nonetheless, the item that concerned me the most, and it's consistent in both of the two documents, is the rigid adherence to the Doctrine and Discipline provisions with little to no room for folks to deviate from them. And that is very clear throughout the documents. And I think it's really extremely rigid. I happen to be a free thinker, and frankly, this would kind of give me theological claustrophobia. But I'm curious what some of my other colleagues think.
The biggest thing of concern for me was the kind of hidden, kind of coded language. I don't know how quite to phrase that, but for example, the LGBTQIA plus is never mentioned anywhere in any of their books. However, what they have repeatedly said is that marriage is between a man and a woman, and gender is defined by birth. Those kinds of things are consistently mentioned while leaving out the core piece. And so it's almost this underhanded, this gives me pause. Why won't they just name the elephant in the room instead of using all these other ways to get around it?
Okay, let me just say LGBTQIA plus, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and everybody in the binary, non-binary gender identities, that's included there. So anybody else, any concerns?
I just would like to say, and I want to acknowledge up front that this is strictly my opinion, but as I read the documents and the modifications in polity around issues like no guaranteed appointment, things like that, I'm concerned that this is going to have an adverse effect on some of our smaller congregations. One of the strengths of United Methodist polity is that we are able, and guaranteed appointment works both ways. It not only gives a pastor a job, but it provides that churches that may not be perceived as all of that attractive because they're smaller or for various reasons are nonetheless supported very strongly by the United Methodist Church's concept of itineracy in the appointed system. And I think in the long run, I hope I'm wrong, but I think this is a polity that will tend to favor larger, more self-sustaining congregations.
Thank you.
All right. So, this is sponsored by a group for retired clergy. And I want to ask a question that relates to retirees. So you write that retired clergy, you write about ways this is going to affect retired clergy who are a part of the Global Methodists. And that in some versions of, so by the way, these books of doctrine and discipline, or the United Methodist Book of Doctrine, those are our discipline, those are our rule books. And Methodists like to have rule books. And so we have one and we change it every 4 years. And then the Global Methodist Church, they're working on theirs right now. So that's what that's about. So I know that there's some talk about how a retiree's relationship changes and their voting status. Could you say a little about that, David?
I guess as the retired guy of the group, they'll expect me to say something about that. I would say, just if I may, I noticed in the chat several people said, where can we get these? And if I assume they will be listed. And I want to say, as I used to tell my students, the most important thing is you read the text. Don't listen exactly to what I'm saying. So go and check out these documents for yourself. But I think as you look at the question of retirees, the first thing to observe is there is no mandatory retirement currently proposed either in the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline or even in the draft. But the other side of that is currently in the United Methodist Church, even though I am a retired clergy and retired lecturer in seminary, I still have all the rights of membership in the annual conference like anyone else. Serve on committees, do work, presumably if I could get the votes, be elected to this, that, or the other thing. That will not be the case in the current proposals in the Global Methodist Church. If you are a retired clergy, you will only retain your right to vote in the annual conference if you meet one of two criteria. You either need to be within 7 years of your last appointment in the Global Methodist Church or when you affiliated with the Methodist Church, or you need to be under a quarter-time appointment. If you meet either of those two, you continue to have voice and vote. If you do not meet those two, you have voice but no vote. Now, here again is another difference. Under the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Discipline, you may be elected as a delegate to General Conference and serve on a committee. by the way, that puts you in the odd position that you couldn't vote for yourself, but you could still get elected. But that's just a polity issue. In the draft book of discipline, there is I think, a significant change. If you are a retired clergy or senior status or inactive, you may not serve as a delegate to general or jurisdictional conference, and you may not vote on delegates to general or jurisdictional conference. If you are a retired clergy and want to keep involved in the life of the church, I would think you would want to think carefully about the implications of those paragraphs for your work in ministry.
So let me make sure so I understand. So retired clergy after 7 years, unless they were under appointment, they wouldn't be able to vote at annual conference. So they wouldn't be able to vote in elections to general conference or matters related to pension and retirement, or really anything at annual conference. Is that right?
If they are not under quarter appointment or 7 years out, they lose their right to vote, but they have voice. But the irony is they, under the transitional book, they could still be elected as a delegate to general conference. They could not under the draft book.
So if you're a retired clergy person and you transfer to the Global Methodist, how might your pension be affected? And I know that's a complex issue, but if you could say a word about that.
I'll defer to Tracy on that, but it's my understanding from everything I've read, Westpath is going to do all that they can to maintain what you have vested and so forth. If you're retired clergy, you should be okay. If you are in another category of clergy, and we might want to talk about that, there could be other issues there.
That is my understanding as well.
Okay, thank you. I mean, again, related to clergy, due process, expulsions, trials, strict adherence. You already mentioned one of your concerns earlier was about strict adherence. Could you talk more about this within the GMC? What will be required in terms of strict adherence and appeals process, trial? What does this all include, and how different is it from our current process for trials in due process in the United Methodist Church? And what happens to those who do not adhere to the GMC rules?
Dave and I will split this. I will talk a little bit about process, and he'll talk about the judicial process on the back end. This is a very intriguing process. As bishops, clergy, and churches join the Global Methodist Church, they will be required to sign a document that they will adhere to the statements that are in the books of Doctrine and Discipline of the Global Methodist Church. If a bishop or a clergy person does not adhere to those changes, they could very easily be brought up on charges and eventually, actually not so eventually, but involuntarily removed from the church. If churches, after signing that statement, do not adhere, there would be a process involved that the attempt would be to make sure, to try to bring them into line. But if they don't, the church could be removed from the denomination. Initially, during the transitional period, that would be a vote by the Transitional Leadership Council, which is the group that will coordinate the work of the Global Methodist Church before the first convening general conference. If laity do not adhere, there is a special provision called a negligent member that is in their transitional book. And a person could be designated as negligent, put on an inactive list, and eventually removed involuntarily from membership in the Global Methodist Church. Some of the specifics regarding what conditions could cause this have not been defined yet, but it's a really important thing for laity to be aware of. Further, I would also add that within the list of charges for both laity and clergy, there are two causes that could cause someone to be brought up on charges. One is promoting doctrines or practices or conducting ceremonies or services that are not in accord with the established provisions of the Global Methodist Church, and disobedience to the order and discipline of the Global Methodist Church. Now, granted, There are provisions in the United Methodist Church where folks can be brought up on charges if they don't adhere to the doctrine and discipline, but it's not the same level of rigidity. And in many cases, there are provisions in our current book of discipline that no one follows, and there are not consequences. But that's not the way it sounds for the global Methodist churches. We'll have to wait and see how that all plays out over time. I would also add that there are some commissions that the Global Methodist Church plans to organize, and there are provisions that they also have the ability to remove folks from membership on those commission boards if they are not subscribing to the doctrinal and moral standards of the Global Methodist Church. And they can dismiss their members if that would be the case. So Dave, would you like to talk a little bit about the appeal and judicial process?
The judicial process, and there is a separate document that came out with the first transitional book that covers this. I've checked through those very carefully as someone who's been involved on both sides of the issue in administrative and judicial procedure, and the wordings are similar. Tracy has already mentioned a few of the tweakings of the chargeable offenses that reflect concerns the Global Methodist Church has around human sexuality. But by and large, there is a similarity in the wording of chargeable offenses, and there is a similarity in the wording of what we call fair process. What again, I think, and Tracy has alluded to this more in terms of tonality and feeling, is that there's a clear sense when you read the text from the Global Methodist Church that they are very concerned, I would say, not just about doctrine, but about a particular interpretation of doctrine. And there is therefore likely to be a greater use of some of these judicial procedures to bring persons into conformity. For the record, the last time the United Methodist or any of its predecessor bodies conducted a trial around doctrine was 1904, when Borden Parker Bound, who's kind of the father of Boston personalism, was accused of in effect, heresy or teaching doctrines that were not compatible. He asked for a trial. And the what was then the old New York East Annual Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church conducted that trial. And the trial court, which consisted of 15 persons, completely exonerated him. And that kind of put an end to this rather intensive doctrinal scrutiny. We have not seen anything like that since then that I can find. If someone out there has a more recent heresy trial, please email me. I'd like it for my files. But basically, we're likely to see an increased use of those judicial procedures in the Global Methodist Church than we are currently seeing in the United Methodist Church.
Okay, well, BT, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just a piece I want to add kind of to what Tracy was saying and going all the way back to what we talked about what concerns us. When I mentioned sort of this coded language, the draft book of Doctrines and Disciplines, when it talks about chargeable offenses, it specifically says in paragraph 902.1d that it is chargeable for promoting doctrines or practices or conducting ceremonies or services that are not in accordance with the established by the Global Methodist Church. They don't define those services in that paragraph. So if you're going to be brought up on charges, now we can understand what they mean, especially given the current culture and human sexuality things, we can infer that. But because they don't say it, they're kind of hiding what the real message is here. But they can also be used for other things. If all of a sudden someone doesn't like whatever ceremony you've had in the church, and it just, I can't even think of an example, but if there was one, then all of a sudden this can be used against you. And it's that undercurrent that you have to rigidly follow. And if you step out of line a little bit, then the vagueness allows it to bring the full weight of it against you. And that scares me, that concerns me.
Well, it's really hard when you're dealing with draft documents until you actually see a general conference approve it. So that's also my concern. But maybe we should talk more since we're talking about interpretation and stuff. Maybe Becca can lead us to doctrine and theology.
Just before we go there, I just wanted to follow up. So just to say a couple of things. One, when I've talked to people who are experts on the discipline and our processes, the thing that concerns them the most is the change in due process. So if you're United Methodist, and this is a big deal for us as United Methodist pastors, if charges are brought against you, there's a certain fixed process and you have some rights. And some of that due process and some of those rights are taken away. So for me, that's the really big thing, is that due process, because that's a part of our covenant with the United Methodist Church. But thank you all for this. So I also wanted to note there's some great questions coming up in the Q&A and in the chat, and we're going to get to a lot of these. And just let me tell you things we're going to be talking about: how to lay people in churches and annual change membership if they wish. What happens if annual conferences are allowed to switch? How are LGBTQ issues being dealt with, etc. So there's a lot more coming up. But now we're going to talk about my favorite subject, and that is the theology and doctrine. I'm a prof of Methodist theology and doctrine. So one of the things I've heard a lot of pastors say who want to join the Global Methodist is that the most important differences between the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church's doctrine. I haven't, really, when I take a look at them, the actual doctrinal standards are exactly the same. The Articles, Confession. Would y'all say a little about the different understandings of doctrine and theology?
For me, it comes down to hermeneutics. I mean, I can say the Nicene Creed without crossing my fingers or my eyes, but I understand that in an historical and theologically reflective way. And I think that really is where we are in this difference. United Methodists encourage an open-ended theological reflection on doctrine that's shaped by an ongoing conversation with Scripture, with our history, with our experience, with the multi-voices, with our contexts that are very significant in any interpretation. And what I fear when I hear things like what you just said is what we mean by doctrine is my particular interpretation of the Chalcedonian Confession or Theotokos or the Nicene Creed or a particular passage in the Bible. And I'm with Tracy. I'm not comfortable in a church where we have a holy office that determines what is the only way to interpret something.
So I want to just follow up a little bit. So what's interesting to me, so one of the differences to me is this level of who interprets. So it's going to be easier to bring charges against somebody on theological and doctrinal issues. Also, the way we tend to do it in the United Methodist Church is we have these shared statements and we affirm them, and would be very difficult to change. So, and we know those statements are in the United Methodist Book of Discipline, and we're not sure, but it looks like it's the exact same theological statements. So I think part of the difference is the issue of enforcement and of it's not. So for example, I love those statements. Okay, so I don't love some of the anti-Catholic language. So there's some pieces of it I don't love, but the main theological creedal claims I love. So it's just interesting to me, this pushback, because in my experience, we're talking about the same God. We're talking about the same Trinitarian God. We're talking about the same Jesus. And it's, I think, a lot. So I don't think that's ultimately, I don't think it's the theology and doctrine that's ultimately the reason for disaffiliation. It may be how we go about enforcing that on everyone. I think that may be the bigger issue. I don't know anybody. I'll stop on this because obviously I could keep going. I think David and I could keep going on this for a long time. Tracy and BT, you want to get in on the doctrine and theology thing?
BT, do you?
I am content with what David said and with what Rebecca said, so I don't have anything else to add to that.
Okay.
Well,
So
I do
David,
have,
yeah.
I do have a
David and I, you can take. We can take this offline later. Okay.
Well, I do have a follow-up question on that. If I'm assuming that the affirmation, I mean, there's the affirmation of the current confession of faith and articles of religion. So if these are affirmed, and there's really not an issue with the historical statements or creeds, how is this formation of a new denomination then a justification for schism or disaffiliation if we actually affirm the same set of doctrines? Anybody want to take a stab on that?
I mean, I can kind of give my thoughts. What I think, Izzy, the best person to answer that question is going to be someone forming the GMC and within the Wesley Covenant Association. They're probably the best people to answer that kind of question. But I think we also want to state that while they are affirming exactly what we're saying with our social or with our doctrines and things like that, they are still, as Rebecca said, worshiping the same Jesus. The people who disagree with us are still just as Jesus-loving Christians as the people who agree with us, and we don't want to villainize or anything like that. We don't want to make them out to be the enemy, because they're not. They're not the bad guys. These are some of them are people who I consider mentors and friends, and and if they're in line with some of these things, I can't speak to how it justifies leaving, but I can speak to the fact that we're still worshiping the same Jesus.
Thank you. That's my rhetorical question is coming from, at least I'm from the Philippines, and I have a lot of my friends are traditionalists. Our bishops are basically traditionalists, and there's always that question, well, don't we live under the traditional plan right now? So why are we leaving? I'll leave it at that. Let's talk about social witness, the social principles, and let's save the questions around LGBTQ plus concerns and inclusion later. Could you share how does the Global Methodist Church do they affirm our current social principles? Do they have a draft of at least their own social principles? And if any, are there any differences?
So I'll answer that one, but yes, there are differences, and within the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Disciplines for the Global Methodist Church, they have paragraph 202 titled Our Witness to the World, which are 14 points, if you will, that would probably be kind of equivalent to what we would call the social principles, although that is not what they are called. They've also said, once there is that first general conference of the Global Methodist Church, they're going to start fleshing out their own version of the social principles. So while they're not exact, there are still these 14 points that, for example, the very first one, we believe that all persons, irrespective of their station or circumstances in life, have been made in the image of God and must be treated with dignity, justice, and respect. We denounce as sin, racism, sexism, and other expressions that unjustly discriminate against any person. That's I'm not going to read all 14 of them. Anyone else is welcome to look at those, but that's their very first one, and they go through that. So there are those statements there. They're different in that they're shorter. They're different that they are not as broad because they're shorter. They're not as broad. And so they're still working on it, and we really can't get into individuals, things like divorce, war, abortion, human rights. They still need to be fleshed out, but they are kind of in those first 14 points.
Okay, thank you so much.
I wanted to follow up on that. So there are two differences that I see. One is that it looks like they're going to have, our social principles are not binding in the sense that you can, whatever it says about alcohol, you can drink, or etc. But they're going to be binding. And also, I noticed when I went through and I would look at mission statement and other things, that the larger social witness tradition of the United Methodists, I won't say it's totally dropped out, but it's really de-emphasized. And so even the statements on racism, it's about individual sin more than it is about the broader structural problems in addition to individual sin, which is of course a big deal as well. So we want to get in some membership questions now. Oh no, I got ahead of myself. So in a little bit, we're going to get into some questions about lay membership and clergy status and membership and how appointments will be made. But before we do that, we wanted to talk about about the issue of issues around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons. So what I want to know is, what does this book of discipline actually say about, we've been talking for decades about what the United Methodist book of discipline said. What does this transitional book of doctrine and discipline say about these issues around marriage, ordination, inclusion, etc.?
I'll take that question. And this really has about 4 parts to it. So bear with me, and I'll try to do this explicitly and carefully. First of all, the transitional book clearly states something about marriage, and it's relevant to this whole issue. And it says, we believe that human sexuality is a gift of God that is to be affirmed as it is exercised within the legal and spiritual covenant of a loving, monogamous marriage between one man and one woman. That sets the tone for human sexuality in their doctrine, in their document. This provision, in effect, denies the affirmation of loving, committed persons who are practicing non-traditional expressions of human sexuality, and declares that same-gender marriage is not to be affirmed. That's point number 1. Second, although I didn't see any provisions in either of the books that specifically prohibit the ordination of LGBTQIA+ folks, their set of chargeable offenses includes the following provision for both clergy and laity. And it is a chargeable offense to engage in sexual activities outside the bounds or bonds of a loving and monogamous marriage between one man and one woman, including but not limited to sexual abuse or sexual misconduct or the possession of pornography or infidelity. So it doesn't necessarily prohibit ordination, but it would be a chargeable offense if a person engaged in sexual activities outside the bounds of a loving monogamous marriage between one man and one woman. So this means that anyone who is a practicing LGBTQIA+ person, if they're ordained, they could immediately be brought up on charges. It also means that you couldn't have a clergy person who is part of a same-gender marriage, because that's a chargeable offense as well. Number 3, the list of chargeable offenses also includes the following for clergy: promoting doctrines or practices or conducting ceremonies. BT alluded to this earlier. The ceremonies they're talking about are same-gender marriages here, or conducting ceremonies or services that are not in accord with the established doctrine and discipline of the GMC. So it will be a chargeable offense if a clergy person in the GMC performed a same-gender marriage. And the 4th, and this deals with transgender individuals. Paragraph 306 defines a person's gender as the person's immutable biological traits identified by or before birth. This specifically discriminates against transgender and intersex people. So, in summary of this, even though they don't specifically mention the word homosexual in their document, and they don't mention LGBTQIA+ folks, their anti-LGBTQIA+ views are very clear.
I wanted to ask a follow-up. Also add that in this discussion of those who can move toward ordination, there is a line that's similar to what we have now about the expectations of candidates in ministry. So I think that also relates to it as well. Yes. So for LGBTQ persons who are here on this call, and for their allies who are just heartbroken about this continuing situation, I mean, what word do you have to say to them about this sort of long delay in this process of change?
Well, I think the only thing that can be said is an apology for the harm that has been done and the hurt that has been perpetrated. And if something good can come out of this, it is the possibility that the United Methodist Church will remove those words that involve incompatibility and enlarge the circle and open up the church to an even more inclusive situation.
Thank you.
Can I be very blunt, Rebecca? Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. The whole situation sucks, and it sucks a lot. For my friends who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, this is painful. It's been painful since 1972. And I'm sorry, and it sucks, and I know that. My goal and dream is that someday it won't. And, you know, I look forward to the day where I can celebrate a same gender wedding in a church sanctuary. As I'm in the officiant of it, I look forward to this. I long for it, and it sucks that it hasn't happened yet. And I'm very sorry.
Amen.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that word. And I think part of, this is going to take a while. We're in a transition. And one of the things that we've hoped for a long time is also more autonomy by region, so that we can set up policies and practices that make sense for us. So we still have a ways to go, I'm sorry to say. Izzy?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask a question around inclusiveness or inclusion and protection against discrimination, but that was kind of partly touched earlier. But if you'd want to share anything, if there's any differences around issues around race, ethnicity, racism, protection against any form of discrimination.
I guess I'd just like to cover a couple of aspects of that. There is a paragraph in their transitional book that says inclusiveness means openness, acceptance, and support that enables all persons to participate in the spiritual life of the church, and so forth and so on. Inclusiveness denies every semblance of discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, disability, or gender. Now, if we think about this, that is very similar to what we have in the United Methodist Constitution, but it also does not define discrimination based on other things that we might want to include a greater level of inclusion on. Things such as age, ethnicity, marital status, family structure, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and so forth. So just by virtue of the fact that they have not included those, that means that they are not focusing on inclusion of those folks. And I guess that's what I would add at this point.
I'd be curious if we will share the same baptismal covenant to resist evil and fight oppression in whatever form it takes and presents itself. I do hope that. And before I pass it on to Becca, to my LGBTQ plus family, this can be triggering because we're being part of the conversation. We're sort of in the middle of this, but know that whatever this church, the big church, whatever church says, we are children of God. Claim it. We are beautiful. We are lovely. Yes, we're in the middle of this, but that doesn't change that fact. It doesn't. And we are loved.
Amen.
Izzy,
Amen. Thank you,
Amen,
Izzy,
Izzy.
for that word. I'm so grateful to you for that word. And I know I pledge myself, and I know a lot of us pledge ourselves to working for a more inclusive church. And that's going to take a bit, and it may be a little bit different from the US and other parts of the world, but we're working toward that. And thank you, Izzy, for saying that. Amen.
If I can touch on the baptismal vows piece, that is listed in their transitional book of doctrines and disciplines. It actually is a specific paragraph, paragraph 316 of what every member, when they are baptized, would say, and specifically regarding resisting evil, injustice, and oppression, it says, do you accept the responsibility to resist evil, injustice, and oppression by the grace and power of God? Now, this is interesting word phrasing here, because it's, do you accept the responsibility? That's great, but are you actually going to do it? And that's not the question, because how often can we say, well, I'm responsible for it, but I'm just not going to do it? That's an interesting turn of phrase there, that if you wanted to get really deeply theological in, we could spend a lot of time, but I don't necessarily want to do that tonight. We can do that another time.
So before we move to the next question, we've got some questions on lay membership and clergy membership and annual conferences and how churches would transfer, how churches would stay. But I want to just answer a couple of clarification questions in the chat. So someone asked about the United Methodist Book of Discipline. So the United Methodist Rule Book stays the same until 2024 when we meet. And so that's how we change that rule book. This transitional book is something that's somewhat fluid of the more conservative church that's going to launch on May 1. And there's so many good questions. So we'll try to put up a Q&A soon to answer some of these excellent questions that we don't get to tonight. So I want to ask a question about lay membership. So let's say I'm a lay person and my church votes to join the Global Methodist Church. What do I do? And we don't know what's going to happen with annual conferences, but if annual conferences are allowed to switch, what will I do in that? And we don't know if disaffiliation is going to be allowed. So what do I do as a layperson if my church is going a different way? If they're going Global Methodist and I want to stay United Methodist, or if they're staying United Methodist and I want to go Global Methodist?
Thanks, Becca, for that question. And there are multiple facets to this. So let me just start this way. If a church decides that it is going to join the Global Methodist Church, and you as a layperson want to go with that church to the Global Methodist Church, you just go with that church.
You just go, yeah.
If, on the other hand, your church decides it wants to join the Global Methodist Church and you want to stay with the United Methodist Church, there will be a process put in place that will enable you to join another United Methodist Church. There are various annual conferences that are working on those sorts of processes right now. If you are in a United Methodist Church that chooses to stay with the United Methodist Church and you want to go join a Global Methodist Church, you can certainly find a Global Methodist Church and join it. There are also processes that would help support those sorts of transition being looked at. If you're in a United Methodist Church that stays in the United Methodist Church and you want to stay there, you don't need to do anything. Now, the question regarding churches and annual conferences is more complex right now, because the Judicial Council is in the process of looking at whether or not an annual conference can vote to leave the United Methodist Church and go to the Global Methodist Church. So I think we'd be better served holding some of that discussion to another time. I would also add, the concept of churches is coming up. Very good. Does that answer your question, Becca?
Yes, and let me say, I think at the May 17th webinar, we can bring in, by that time we should know about the Judicial Council decision.
Yes.
And we can bring in, we've got David Livingston, but we can also particularly bring in someone to address those issues when we know more, because right now we just don't know. And I know that's anxiety producing. But yeah, the next one is about, that Izzy's asking is about clergy membership and then churches.
Let's talk about clergy status and membership. If I'm a clergy person in the UMC and I want to stay in the UMC as a member of my annual conference, what do I do if the Judicial Council decides it is legal for my annual conference to leave the UMC for the GMC, and then my annual conference votes to do that? What happens to me?
Well, I think the first thing that we'll need to make sure we, as clergy, if your annual conference is leaving, or even your local congregation is going to leave, as a clergy person, the first thing we need to do if we're going to stay is be in contact with our district superintendent. We need to make sure that is happening. But from there, until we see the exact wording from the Judicial Council, it's really tough to say. However, as a United Methodist, our credentials will stay United Methodist unless we move them, and we'll have to deal with all of that based on how this legislation works out. I'm grateful for the May 17th piece, because hopefully by then we'll have some answers. I will actually tune into that one because I'm going to need these answers too.
The least amount of stress will occur if there is a compatibility between the pastor and the congregation, irrespective of whether annual conference as a whole or can or cannot, depending on what the Judicial Council decides. What will make the transition more difficult is if you as a pastor and the congregation to which you are currently appointed want to move in a different direction. And depending on how that goes, if you are a United Methodist clergy and wish to remain, and say your congregation votes to join the Global Methodist Church, then as BT pointed out and Tracy alluded to, you simply contact your district superintendent and your bishop. And while there's likely to be some variation as annual conferences work on trying to manage the processes for this, there will be some processes that will enable you to end up where you would like to be.
And we've got a question. Thank you. We've got a question in the chat that relates to something that the next question for on our list, and that is about churches that are leaving. So, if we had if the protocol had been voted on and passed, or some other similar thing, we would have had a certain mechanism for churches to leave. Churches can still leave the United Methodist Church, and again, we don't know. Some people think the protocol is dead. We don't know what's going to happen in 2024. There could be something similar. We don't know. But in any case, right now, what do I do? Or how is my church going to decide this? Does my church have to have a vote? Do we have to go through this? Who decides whether we have to have a vote? What percentage would the vote have to be? That is now, without any of those other agreements that might or might not come.
Right now, under current church law, there are two operative paragraphs in the Book of Discipline dealing with how a local church can move into the Global Methodist Church. Paragraph 2553 that was added at the 219 Special General Conference, and paragraph 2548.2, which has been around for a while. And I am told, Tracy and BT, you can jump in here and help me because you are duped in more to these committees than I am. Different annual conferences can elect different paths, whether they want to do 2553 or 2548. The Council on Bishops has produced a comedy model agreement that you can use that is really, we can probably post that for people interested. That's based on 2548.2. And a lot of what is in there is similar to the processes in 2553. But clearly, the first step would be for churches that want to go with the Global Methodist Church to decide in negotiation with their annual conference which route the conference is permitting or following, and then put that procedure in place.
But and part of the answer to the question is no, not all churches will have to vote, right?
No, not at all. First of all,
many will not, and they'll be thanking God that they don't have to do that, and the structure. And just
there really is right now a key. We just got to pause till we figure out what the Judicial Council is going to do.
Yeah. So I also wanted to note, given some of the comments in the chat, so David was just quoting a lot of numbers from the Book of Discipline. So the United Methodists have a Book of Discipline that's going to stay. There was a deal that was sort of informally worked out, not official, right? Called the protocol that would have given some mechanisms for doing that.
Right.
And there's some other proposals, and those would be considered at the next general conference, whether they would, it's going to be difficult to get anything to pass. So we're trying to do some of this now and to sort some of this out. Yeah. So yeah, Izzy, are you ready for the next one?
Yeah, before I move on to the question of bishops, I just want to make clear to people, because keep hearing the protocol that is being mentioned. It's a proposal that's before General Conference. It's rightfully there. It will get a vote in 2024. But people are acting or talking as if it is actually real and happening and operative. It is not.
It's not.
Yeah.
It is not. Okay. It's a proposal. It's not happening. So just be very clear about that. So let's talk about bishops. What's the biggest differences between the election authority of bishops in the UMC and the GMC? And maybe if you have time to address support structure for Central Conference bishops, because right now we share a common Episcopal fund. Anybody? BT?
So I'll talk about the bishops, but I'll leave the Common Episcopal Fund and Central Conferences for either David or Tracy. But as far as bishops are concerned, one of the big things is that the draft book of Doctrines and Disciplines for the Global Methodist Church elects bishops for 12-year terms with a possible 2-year extension. That's it. And while there isn't a process set, the current proposal is each annual conference will nominate 2 elders for consideration, and a ballot would be developed, and then they would be voted on, and a 60% majority would be required to elect. And when a vacancy occurs, they would, start that process to get a new bishop. That big thing there, though, is it's only a 12-year term with a possible 2-year extension. No more lifetime appointments for bishops. And I know some people have really, want this, and even within the United Methodist Church, some have said that's a good idea. You can go either way on that, but that is what they are going to do in the Global Methodist Church for bishops. That's the biggest difference.
What about the authority of bishops?
David, do you want to speak to that one specifically?
As I read this, I want to preface it by saying that as I read this, the authority of bishops would be weakened in several ways. One, term episcopacy means that you're not going to be in there with a presumably lifetime pending good behavior vote. Certainly the authority of bishops is going to be weakened, secondly, by their more restrictive role in the appointment process, restrictions by way of adding the kind of consultation Tracy alluded to earlier. And of course, again, throughout the language in the transitional book, as well as in the draft book of discipline, there is this sense that bishops are expected to be the agents of maintaining doctrinal authority in the life of the church. And that's going to be a significant part of what will be expected of them. It sounds like, go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to answer the question about the Central Conference bishops, but BT,
Yeah.
there's something else you wanted to add first?
Yeah.
No, that's fine.
It occurred to me as we were talking. One of the big differences in the authority of the bishop is that the bishop will approve all ordinands. If you're going to be ordained, the bishop has to sign off on it. That is a huge change.
That's an enhancement.
That is a huge change compared to where we are now. Their process, you have to be approved by a 2/3 vote of elders of an annual conference in the executive session and approved by the bishop. And that adds in there. That has implications all over the place. If the bishop I came in under had some personality conflicts with people, if they don't want you to be a pastor, you don't get ordained under this draft book of Doctrines and Disciplines. Under the current United Methodist Book of Discipline, we take that is not a thing. Once you're voted on by executive session, the bishop doesn't get a say at that point. They can't refuse to ordain you, whereas this one does. And if we're going to be honest, if the Global Methodist Church suddenly had a bishop that did not want there to be a woman pastor, a minority pastor, they would just say no. And that's it, because they can. And I'm not saying they're going to, and there have been statements put out saying they won't do that, but that doesn't mean they can't. And that, I think, is significant.
And let's do this briefly, because we've got some more questions, and also we have a couple of polls that we want to do. So if we can keep these last ones brief before we go on.
In answer to Izzy's question about the bishops that are outside the United States, in the current world, all the bishops' salaries and costs are paid by the Episcopal Fund. In the Global Methodist Church, support for bishops of annual conferences outside the United States will come from an annual conference inside the United States, and there'll be a pairing that will occur. So Conference A in the United States will be paired with conference whatever outside the United States, where necessary, where they need financial support.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can go on to appointments.
Yeah. So, but first, we're going to do a couple of polls. That's part of what we had said we were going to do. So, Jim, are you ready to get a couple of polls for us? Can you do the one on the one about where people are located? Are they in what jurisdiction or central conference they're in? Would you pop that one up? And friends, this is a two-part poll. The first one is for people who are United Methodists in the United States whose membership is here. Well, it's all mixed up actually. But if you're from a central conference, you're going to pop up too. It's just so if you don't know, that's fine. But if you could click what jurisdiction you're from in the United States or what central conference you're going to be, and the other is going to pop up. The other choices are going to pop up in a minute. So you'll be able to see that. And then, Jim, if we could get the poll up about, the one about whether people's churches have had an opportunity to talk about these issues. So that'll be the next one. So while that's coming up, then why don't we go ahead and talk about the next topic, or if anybody has anything to say about that one, the last one, before we go on.
Go ahead.
All right. So Izzy, are you up next?
I think it's appointments, Becca.
All right.
Yeah,
So, okay, appointments is the next one. All right. So friends, what are a couple of main differences between the way appointment making happens in the Global Methodist Church and currently what we have in the United Methodist Church? So what's the big difference between them, and what are the implications for that? Thank you.
So I'll take that one. For appointments, the biggest difference is there are no guaranteed appointments. Right now within the United Methodist Church, elders are guaranteed an appointment. Churches are guaranteed a pastor. This is fantastic. It works. Well, it can be good, it can be bad, but I think it's good. It protects, especially our female clergy, our minority clergy, it protects them. But now within the Global Methodist Church, if they want a change, the bishop and cabinet consult with the pastor and the church and the congregation through their pastor parish committee, their SPRC, or depending on how you want to phrase that. But in the end, the bishop still fixes the appointment. The bishop still has the final say, which is very much how it goes here. But the bishop is under no obligation to fill that appointment. They are under no obligation to send an elder or a deacon somewhere. If the bishop decides not to appoint someone, they are required to provide a written statement, and clergy not appointed by the bishop of their annual conference can seek an appointment in another annual conference. But if they do not have an appointment, they are considered inactive clergy, which impacts their ability to vote on various items at annual conference. So again, that's a big piece there. Now, there is a detailed process for clergy appointments. There is within the draft book of Doctrines and Disciplines, paragraphs 520 to 522, there are discussions about how that works and how they're going to interview pastors, and pastors can put their names in to be considered. So, but it's significant, and I could spend an hour tonight just talking about that. And I don't necessarily want to take all of our time for that, but please do check that draft book where it goes more in depth.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, BT. So we want to run a couple more polls before we're done, and also just make some final comments. So I can't run the polls. So Jim, would you do the one asking if people's churches have had an opportunity to discuss this? Would you put that one up next? There you go. Do y'all see the poll? Has your local church offered opportunities to learn about and discuss the options and issues that are facing us as members and churches consider separation from the United Methodist Church? Many opportunities, a few, no events, and uncertain. And by the way, this is your best guess, right? You're making the best guess you can here, or uncertain. Do you want to go on? Is
Yeah,
the next question
well,
while we're doing this? Yeah.
Rob, while that's happening, we partially talked about ordination earlier, but if you're a lay person, you want to become a pastor, what's the difference in the process between the GMC and the UMC? What about educational requirements? Are there any differences in the GMC and UMC process leading to ordained ministry? And the poll
And
is
friends, can someone do that in 1 minute?
Go
Or
ahead,
less?
BT.
Yeah.
Take it, BT.
I'll do my best. But essentially, part of what is the same is the beginning steps. If you decide you are called to be a pastor in the Global Methodist Church, those are the same. You have to have background checks, credit checks. You have to be a member of a Global Methodist Church for at least 1 year. But we get into some of the difference that, where is it? To get differences, you have to have the examinations, you have to be approved by the bishop, you have to sign a statement saying you will adhere to these doctrines. Those are some of the more nuanced differences that we can't really say if they're good or bad, they're just different.
So, and the issues around education are also different as well. But let's go ahead and do a couple of more polls as Don and I make some final comments. So you can see this. You saw the results from poll 5. There's another poll in there about how important is full inclusion to you. Would you put that one up next, Jim? So I want to say thank you to the people who've organized, and I think we can stay on a little longer and talk, but if you would go to this poll next, how important is for you that the United Methodist Church become fully inclusive, and it gives in terms of race and ethnicity, gender identity, LGBTQ plus inclusion, etc. So I want to say, guys, just to the audience, y'all have hung with us with
Yes.
really complex stuff. So I will tell you, I get off conversations about these things and I call my friends who are like world-renowned experts in polity and our book of discipline to try to figure out the answers to these things. So it is highly complex. On May 17th, we're going to have another opportunity. We'll try to get somebody to put a Q&A together. We'll save these questions and try to get somebody to put a Q&A together to respond to them and put it on the website where you registered. And again, we can keep going. And I'll share.
we have one last question about the trust clause?
Yes.
Yes, why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? I'll share the results of this and we'll start another poll. So this is how important is full inclusion. And then Jim, would you run the question first about whether individuals are think they expect to leave, and then whether churches. So if you would do those two. So as an individual, are you inclined to stay? And then, so yes, if you'll go ahead and talk about the trust clause, that'd be fabulous.
That's Dave's question.
Okay.
The answer is very simple. There will be no trust clause envisioned in the Global Methodist Church. Congregations will own their own property and thereby share all the responsibilities that ownership entails.
That's a simple one. Yeah. And there will be money set aside because if people do leave the GMC, they'll still have to pay for their pension liability. They'll still be accountable for that.
Correct.
All right, so we've got, I'm going to share this poll. Are you inclined to stay with the United Methodist Church? I hope somebody's screenshotting these things or we can save them. And would you bring the next one up, Jim, about how inclined do you think your church is to stay? Oh, let's do the individual one first. All right, so a lot of us are welcome. You're welcome to email us. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I know others are as well. If you have questions, and I will say, it may take me a while to get around to them because I may get a lot of emails on there. All right, and if you would share the next one, Jim, just the one about how are you inclined? You think your church is inclined? So do you think your local church is inclined to stay in the United Methodist Church? So as we're doing this one, I just want to say thanks to everybody. I know Don's got a final word to say, and I want just to say to the people who are still listening, and you guys have hung with us. We are we got 3 Western Pennsylvania, a couple of Coloradans, we got somebody from Arkansas Conference. We're a particular snapshot of things, right? We're a particular snapshot. And the May 7th is going to have more people. We'll have a little more jurisdictional representation. So that'll be a little different. This is one snapshot. And did you notice on here, we have some real disagreements. So I'm more theologically conservative than I think that David is, it sounds like. And we agree on some things about the United Methodist Church, but I just say, I thank God that I'm in a church where we can have these disagreements and we can still be together and we can still worship together and do ministry in the world and be a church that makes disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And I'll show this poll to you, and Don, you can take it off. We can stay on a while or not as you wish. Don, or you want to get on?
All right, you got the responses. Thank you so much to the panelists, to our hosts, Rebecca and Izzy, for the donors who made possible this evening's program, for the donors who are going to help us create the May 17th event to help to support the technology and all that's involved. Obviously, this is a complex question, and there's an urgency to it all, as many people are being misled, and many people do not have the full answers to the questions they want answered. This is a pressing question, and it is one that's going to continue to perplex us all. We're going to need the leadership of our bishops in a unique way to lead us through this, along with great leaders from our laity and clergy. For those of you who are in the trenches working, you active pastors and laity, I thank you for your service. We as retired pastors believe in the United Methodist Church. We believe in full inclusion, and we think the future of United Methodism will be a place more faithful to the inclusive love of God in Jesus Christ. So do not be misled. God's love is inclusive and is meant for all. And so we invite you to come back on May 17th. You will need to register again at umarc.org. You can get a copy of this recording there in a few days. Involve your churches. This is an issue of immense importance, and we're grateful for the tremendous leadership that we've had tonight. And I know your questions were not all answered because we've never had such a busy chat line as we've had, and it was impossible, but yet they talked as fast as they could, authoritatively and honestly and forthrightly and accurately. So I greatly appreciate all those persons who participated. Good night, and thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.